Hello and welcome. Extended the flight ban on India. So what is going forward? What can Indians expect if they're hoping to travel abroad?
So the first thing is, if you look at the two countries which have actually eased out restrictions, and as you said, if you go deeper into it, there are still a number of gray areas which need to be resolved. But obviously, this does provide some relief, because both countries have a large Indian diaspora. So one, people who want to meet their relatives, who want to meet their families, students in the UK, and then of course even travelers. Now, if one were to look at the UK, the first, what they have done essentially is that basically earlier you needed to quarantine in hotels. Now there is this provision for home quarantine if you fulfill certain conditions. Now that was obviously logistically that was a nightmare, and you have to pay much more, and so that way it's important that at least you have the option, even if you don't fulfill certain conditions, you can quarantine at home. So that part is eased out. Now, when you look at the United Arab Emirates, what they have done again with certain restrictions, but at least they have eased out things, for people who are residents, for those for transit passengers. Now, the transit passenger part is very important because for students who are studying, who want to go to the UK, who want to go to US, who even want to go to Canada, this makes life easier. At least, obviously, you're paying much more. The cost of the tickets, you're paying exorbitant prices. So it's still, that part is still there, but at least in the short run, that this aspect has been addressed. So broadly speaking, these three categories, the people who want to meet their families, students, travelers, and more, even professionals. Actually, travelers are actually the last. If you look at it, I don't think at this point of time there are certain people. Obviously, Dubai for Indians is easier, but then if you come to the next point, UAE easing out things has definitely helped. So they have one more option. People, especially for countries, obviously, as you mentioned, Australia's borders are likely to remain closed still somewhere in 2022. But at least for Canada, which has not opened direct flights, then the routes are very circuitous. But at least there is some option. You can go either via UAE, you can go via Europe or whatever to Canada. So that way, as I said, the UAE, this is very important. The UK part, when we look at it, we need to slightly break it down. And, there are a few things which need to be addressed. The first is there is this great confusion about, the acceptance. Obviously, one problem which Indians are having is about the acceptance of the vaccines which are being administered in India. Now, naturally, Covishield has more acceptability in Europe. In UK, it's even if you've got 2 doses of Covishield, as of now, you have the option of home quarantine. So since you've been moved from the red list to the amber list, you have the option of home quarantine, but quarantine is still there. Whereas if you have been administered by a vaccine which is recognized by the UK already, then you don't even need that home quarantine. So that's something which will need to be addressed, and that can only be addressed either if Indians, whether students, travelers, whoever, if there is more of a choice, either more of a choice or the Indian vaccines get an approval. So I'll give you a simple example of some of the logistical issues which persist. So there was this, there was this case of an individual recently who had to, was a professional working in the UAE. And when he had to return, he realized that the first dose he was administered was Covaxin. So obviously he had to return on time and everything. So the second dose which he took then was Covishield, because that is recognized in UAE. So I think a lot of issues will actually become clearer over the next couple of months. There's talk even about, obviously Covishield will get more approvals from a number of countries, but even this whole thing, once WHO gives, I think, Covaxin approvals, and Covaxin, gets a wider acceptance globally, that leaves out things. And then most important, I think, having more choices. So for instance, if you have a couple of other American vaccines administered in India, once you have that choice, it will make things much easier. But this is definitely a short-term reprieve. And thankfully, at this point of time, I mean, if you know, travel is, as I said, travel for leisure is not high on the priority list, so that way it's okay. But at least urgent travel, it has been addressed, right? So this is
Right.
as far as, and I'm sure, I think a lot really depends when, you know, the other countries also take these decisions. A lot depends upon, you know, that they have to keep in mind, you know, the diaspora, the composition of the diaspora, the, you know, that there are a large number of expats from India, especially UAE has to do it, and obviously even
Yeah.
UK needs to bear that in mind. At the end of the day, even their economy is dependent upon Indian students, you know, the second largest group within the international student community. So all
Absolutely.
that is there. But now the next issue, I think what really needs, Canada really needs to open up direct flights, because otherwise students are really having a problem. So
Yeah.
if, as of now, there are no positive indicators in that direction in the short run. I think probably till the end of September they've said, or end of August they've said that they're still going to keep the restrictions. I think that is something which, because since there is a large student population and as a diaspora and everything else, so Canada really needs to look at that.
Right.
US has also kept certain, already had eased out restrictions for students and everything else. So that's the one part. Now, the other thing which you also need to look at, apart from, you know, the removal of restrictions, nothing is really it's all going to be static. It has to be very dynamic. All these restrictions have been removed. They can be put back in place. It will really depend upon the trajectory of the pandemic now in the next couple. Because, you know, in India, there's a talk of a third wave. Other countries also, in the West especially, in the US and certain European countries, that again, there's a spread of this Delta variant. So calibrations will have to be done. But what can be ensured is that at least for certain categories, you know, people who have families, people who are students, or people who are nationals or residents. So, for instance, like UAE also has eased out the restrictions. Essentially, if you look at the categories, it's largely people who are already resident in the UAE, which means professionals, or which
Correct.
means people. So that sort of thing you need to keep in place. That should not close down at all. At times, you know, countries are overreactive. That creates a lot of problems. So those channels need to be kept open. The other aspect about opening up of bubbles and all will have to be according to the situation. You know, as the situation changes, things will keep.
So right, it's going to be very dynamic, and you have to keep a lookout on how their policies change, how the pandemic carries on, and accordingly, we have to be watchful. So, sir, now I would like to shift our focus to the second part of this discussion, where we focus more on the geopolitics that's taking place in Iran, where the new president, has recently spoken to French President Emmanuel Macron, and there are talks of perhaps reviving the nuclear deal. So this signals a willingness to talk, and how do you read this?
I think this was bound to happen because, you know, before he took over as president, obviously the stance of the Raisi, Ebrahim Raisi, as he's referred to, was very different. He was quite, I mean, his remarks, they were not very anti-China, but he was much tougher on the West, specifically the US. He's also supposed to have, I think he also said that he's not going to even meet the US president. And this was in stark contrast to his predecessor. As far as Rouhani, obviously, also had in the last few years, he had been pushed to the wall and he had no other option but to be anti-West. But he was always open to negotiations, to diplomacy, to engagement. Now, the Trump administration's approach, you know, created further problems for him, and domestically also, you know, he was left with limited options, but then to take some sort of anti-US posturing and move closer to China. Now, if one were to look at the new president, a couple of things. First, as I said, before he took over, he had made some anti-West remarks. But at the same time, he also realizes the economic challenges which Iran faces. And he has already been warned that, you know, isolationism will not help. I mean, if you look at the numerous challenges which Iran faces in terms of rising inflation, negative growth rates. This year, I think it's been forecast that they'll go at about 1.5% or something. And there have been protests also recently because of water shortages, power outages, and all that. So there are major challenges. Now, he needs to balance out various his domestic constituencies. And obviously the immediate challenge for them is the economic challenges. Now that gives him some space to adopt a more pragmatic approach. So he will obviously make this, he's going to keep on continuously saying that I cannot blindly kowtow to what the US says or to what the other E3 countries, that is UK, Germany and France, say that, Iran's policy towards the Middle East needs to change. It should not support proxies. Second, about the aspect of the JCPOA, with regard to Iran's nuclear program, that Iran should basically come back to full compliance. These are the two things he said that he cannot accept. But that again, let's look at it. He has to play to a certain constituency. Ultimately, both the US and Iran will have to find a happy sort of meeting ground. Now, one suggestion which was made earlier was that incrementally the US had begun to remove sanctions, but over the past few days again they've imposed some sanctions, and what they've also done is they've said that if Raisi is not willing, is going to be a tough negotiator, then we'll have to take very tough measures as well. Now that is going to be problematic. The second is what you have had, this attack on a sort of oil tanker of Oman, which has Israeli connections. So naturally, the reactions from Israel, US and UK have been quite strong to this attack. Now, how will this impact, the geopolitics of the Middle East in the short run? That is something which we need to keep a close watch on. And apart from the talks between Raisi and Macron, what we've also had is you have the head of the CIA. He's also visiting Israel. I think probably he's one of the people who played an important role in the 2015 JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. So it remains to be seen as to how that visit also plays out, and whether the US can, because Israel has been putting a lot of pressure on the US as to even recently now, even Saudi Arabia has once again said that we are okay with the JCPOA, but basically Iran should not be given too much leeway with regards to a nuclear program, and a close watch should be kept on its geopolitical moves in the Middle East. Now, how does the US balance this out? Simply put, for Iran, the constraint is, the removal of sanctions is imperative if it wants some economic relief, if the people actually want some economic relief. For the US, they need to keep a clear watch, because if they keep on taking a stridently anti-Iran stance, that means Iran will move closer to China, and that's something which probably they would be cautious about. The 25-year agreement, which was signed in March, is a clear reiteration of Iran-China relations. And the second part is also about the recommendation of many people that the the improvement of ties is essential. So the US has a back channel with Iran, also for having some leverage, for more leverage in Afghanistan. So there are multiple factors, and at the end of the day, both sides, as we earlier shows also we've discussed, that negotiations, both sides have to find a middle ground. There will have to be, it cannot be, you cannot not adopt a maximalist position, and Raisi will have to shed some of his isolationism, and obviously, talk to the French president was a good move in that sense. And obviously, speaking to somebody else would have probably given the signals that he's, if he had spoken to, say, some representative from the UK, or would have been very different. So Macron can also play, the focus was also on bilateral relations, and you can also say that he's obviously he will have a tilt towards the US, and he's part of the signatories, but it gives the right signaling that you're open for negotiations, but you won't totally kowtow. That was important. And France also did give, they, on the other hand, what France said was that you should get back to the negotiations, because since 20th of June, these negotiations in Vienna, they began in April, but since the 20th of June, there has been no further progress. And I would like to reiterate, the US needs to really show patience, and it should not, even after this attack recently on the oil tanker and after the strong reactions, it's important that the US is not too reactive and impulsive, because then that will further increase tensions, and that will only result in whatever, I mean, basically bringing whatever progress has been made to naught. So Iran needs to demonstrate flexibility. US needs to be patient, and both sides need to understand each other's constraints. And other countries like France, India can play an important role in somehow calming down things and reducing these tensions.
Absolutely, sir. So it's interesting to watch how Iran and US ties and negotiations go further from here, because both places have new regimes, new heads of the state. Thank you very much, Mr. Trividesh Singh Maini, for breaking down the biggest developments in geopolitics this week. And to our viewers, I hope you enjoyed the show. Do stay tuned for Global Chit Chat next week as well. Thank you.